I suppose just before throwing it open to the floor for discussion, just a couple of questions, I suppose, that come to my mind arising from some of the points that you raised. When things go wrong in the trust relationship because, let's say, the news organisation, in your case BBC, has got it wrong, do you think that as a state body you're better or worse at dealing with the aftermath of that in terms of openness, being accountable, having a sense of accountability?
I think it's not because we're a state body. In fact, we talk about ourselves being a public body rather than a state body. I think some aspects of that can get in the way because we're a bureaucratic organisation, we're a large institution, and one of the important things about accountability and openness is the ability to be able to respond quickly, and that can be hard in an organisation, where there are a number of levels of responsibility. So that maybe cuts in one direction. I think in the opposite direction is the ethos of the organisation, the relationship with the audience, the awareness that the audience are directly paying for the BBC, and from next April the World Service will also be funded directly by licence fee payers in the UK. And as I say, the influence of social media, which for more and more journalists means that they have a direct relationship. It's not a broadcasting relationship anymore. It is a much more interactive relationship. And so I think these two things are in contention with each other. A bureaucratic organisation that inevitably is worried about making mistakes. Social media can create errors as well as improving openness. But I think that in that balance we are moving in the right direction, but there are problems and errors along the way.
How would you rate the organisation's performance in responding to some recent controversies? Let's say the executives' payoff, the Jimmy Savile controversy. If you just take those two, how would you rate how the organisation responded to that?
I'd look at how audiences responded to it rather than give my own analysis of it. Trust in the organisation has dipped in both cases. It's come back up. It hasn't come back quite to the level that it was before those things happened. So I think that's a fair verdict on it. Clearly there were mistakes made, both in terms of the original judgments, but also not necessarily understanding the depth of the problem and getting to that. As I indicated at the beginning of my remarks, at least now with both those situations, I think everything is out there. As an organisation, a journalistic organisation that exposes other people to scrutiny, and an organisation that gives it out, as it were, we have to be prepared to take it. It's been painful, in some cases it's been embarrassing for the organisation. It's certainly been quite distressing for individual members of staff who haven't had responsibility for many of these things. They've felt that discomfort of an organisation that is still rightly highly respected, but has taken some knocks, and we can only hope that those things are being put behind us through answering the tough questions that have been asked, and with luck, with a new chief executive, a new director general in place, that we can move on.
Just, you mentioned there about the trust indicators. How do you measure that? Do you have an index? Do you have a survey, a qualitative survey?
There's tracking surveys. Yeah.
In those tracking surveys, do they differentiate, or is there a crossover between if there's something wrong in the organisation that doesn't directly have to do with editorial output? In other words, it's not a case that you put out a programme or you made a mistake and you got it wrong, but it's something to do with the culture of the organisation. Do those surveys show then a lack of trust or a decline in trust in the news, or do they make that differentiation at all?
Well, clearly these things interrelate with each other, so there's an overall awareness of the BBC and its overall reputation, value for money of the organisation, the overall BBC brand, and then specific questions about news. And sometimes it's slightly hard to disentangle those things, but there clearly is a different response to do with corporate issues, governance, levels of pay, those kinds of things from editorial issues. And on the editorial side of things, there was a significant reduction during last autumn when the Jimmy Savile story was being reported. that editorial confidence in the BBC has grown again. The more recent corporate events will have had some effect on that, but people do make distinction between them.
You mentioned about social media and how you feel less worried by, the threat posed by social media to an organisation like BBC than you were 5 years ago. You describe the development of social media as if your thinking has changed, that instead of being a threat, it's now a tool. Does that mean that you just no longer see it as a serious threat to what you do? So, for example, if you're operating to certain journalistic requirements and standards that satisfy yourself, sometimes, if you're in the website online business, speed counts. So sometimes I might pick up something online, it's not on the BBC yet, because you guys might not be totally satisfied as to its veracity, and I can get it somewhere else. And maybe it turns out that it is true. There's a battle between a kind of journalistic checking and all of that, and the battle for speed to get stories out there. Do you not see social media, in the wider sense of the word, still as a threat?
Well, clearly, the challenge to incorporate that information into our content at the speed with which we have to, whilst also maintaining our accuracy, that gets in some ways more difficult because there's more information. I suppose what I was referring to was a sense that, and some of the academic commentators in this conference have been part of this discussion, that somehow social media, citizen media, as a kind of phenomenon, was a kind of existential challenge to traditional news organisations, that somehow there was a sort of a battle between those two, and that crowdsourcing or citizen media would kind of naturally win out. And I think we've moved on from that, largely because news organisations have found ways of accommodating and using social media to fit with their brand values. But absolutely, every major story where there is an opportunity for social media to play into it, the Boston bombings aftermath would be an example. But we saw there where some major news organisations used information which came in one way or another from social media or was amplified via social media, made significant mistakes, damaged their own news brands when they did that. The BBC made one small set of mistakes, one small mistake during the course of that, but some of the more significant erroneous information we didn't broadcast. We were relieved that we did that, and that testing of your news brand in the fire of those stories and how you come through it, and the way that you do this kind of careful incorporation, testing and retransmission of the appropriate information. It's a very severe test of an organisation, but I don't see it as being a threat. I see it as something that we just have to adjust to and get smarter at dealing with.
If you, we talked a little bit earlier in the previous session, was talked about impartiality and all of the requirements around that, and it's about giving both sides of the story. At the same time, there seems to be a growing appetite for opinion. Do you feel that there is room for both of those within the confines and the rules that apply to an organisation like the BBC? I mean, I noticed you gave the quote from the political correspondent to describe the Cameron situation. You know, he's humiliated, he's diminished, which is probably a statement of fact, but it also kind of gets into the opinion realm as well. Where do you think those boundaries should lie? Is there room to shift them, actually?
Well, I don't think they should shift for a public broadcaster like the BBC. I think there is a genuine debate about whether the kind of fairness doctrine restrictions that there are on a range of other broadcasters, including commercially funded public broadcasters. Stuart Purvis is a former Ofcom guy, would be more expert about this than I am. But I think particularly because of over-the-top video, totally unregulated, that sits outside Irish, UK, EU regulation, there is going to be a challenge to that. And we heard it from TV3 this morning, that gets in the way of the business models of organisations that want to be able to do the news, but can't allow their news to be as vibrant as they want it to be, because it can't reflect the range of opinions that they believe would be commercially attractive. I think it is very different for the main public broadcaster and the particular responsibility that it has to reflect the views of society overall and to do that fairly. And although I can understand the intellectual case to say, well, impartiality is unattainable, and therefore, why even bother about it? I think for a publicly funded and a publicly accountable organisation, the alternative, which is just let many opinions rip, I'm sure society and politics would reject that. So definitely maintain that approach for organisations like the BBC, even if that means that there's a certain vibrancy or a verve to the journalism which, whatever you might think of them, the Foxes or the MSNBCs kind of cut through because they're really telling the story as they see it. We have to hold back from that. We have to eschew that and say we have to stick to the role that society wants us to play.
At this point, just put it open to the floor. Any questions? We have a mic. Yep.
Hi, Peter. I'm interested in the issue of trust for people in authoritarian regimes, and you referred to this yourself in Egypt a little. Because their own media organisations have such little trust and they know they behave in a very bad way, it's actually primed them to believe that Western media organisations behave in the same way. So, the Egyptian protesters originally believed the BBC was on their side, and now they're wondering what you're up to. Do you have much data about the attitude or the scepticism of people in those regimes, for example, Middle East dictatorships or China, specifically towards the BBC? And do you know that if they are sceptical, what can you do other than criticising your own government to establish your kudos in the area, what you can do to make yourself trusted in those countries?
There are quite a lot of differences between different countries, and so the idea of being able to have impartial and trusted news is less readily accepted, partly because people just have not had exposure to it and the practice of it, so they tend to sort of believe that it's something which is not possible. We know that they're distrustful of state broadcasters. Indeed, one of the things that we believe will be of advantage to the BBC when the World Services funding moves from being funded directly by the UK Foreign Office to being paid for by the British people through the licence fee, which happens next April, is that we'll be able to say we're paid for by the British public rather than by the British government. Interestingly, in the Middle East generally, commercial media is more trusted than state-funded media. Not surprisingly, because state-funded media tends to be more biased. In terms of what can we do, I referred briefly to Egypt, and we're creating some editorial compilations at the moment which are about the consistency of our reporting, which simply show the BBC's reporters, the BBC Arabic team have covered this story fairly. I mean, just by showing people clips of the journalism that we've done, the way in which we've challenged different people in authority, and to remind people of the consistency of the BBC's approach. I don't think that everyone will suddenly say, oh yes, we believe in BBC impartiality. I think that in stressful situations in societies in conflict, I can understand why people might be attracted to media that reinforces their views. But what we do know is that in times of crisis, audiences around the world particularly turn to the BBC. So they may enjoy watching Al Jazeera some of the time, but then because they're aware that Al Jazeera's had views which are closely associated with its funding government, we know that they've turned to the BBC in the last couple of years in very large numbers. So that's the best thing that we can do, is to stick to our guns in terms of the truthfulness of our reporting.
Okay. Another question there at the back. Yeah.
Peter, I wonder if I could ask you about what may be the unexpected consequences of when there is a diminution in trust of the BBC as an institution, not so much around the content, but around the way it's run. Your predecessor as the head of global news, Richard Sambrook, wrote in The Guardian this morning, this government may be about to politicise the BBC to a greater extent than any of its predecessors. This was a follow-up to a speech made by the Culture Minister, Maria Miller, last week, in which she said that the National Audit Office, which is the government's auditor, should have virtually unfettered access to the BBC's accounts. When she was asked what that mean, for instance, supposing the BBC sent 3 camera crews to China, would the National Audit Office investigate that? She said, no, not kind of stuff like that. But she didn't make it entirely clear what the limits were on the access to the National Audit Office. Also in the speech, she made a number of references to soft power. Now, soft power, as you know better than the most, is a term used, particularly in the United States following the Iraq War, as a kind of better way of getting your messages across than invading countries, to be blunt. Now, it's been adopted, but it's very much seen in a context of foreign policy. So she was talking about the BBC delivering soft power. She was talking actually about commercial television delivering soft power. So if you take this combination of soft power and politicians' access to BBC accounts, you could sort of see where Richard Sambrook may be coming from.
Yeah, I can see that threat. Equally, I can understand why, when the BBC's corporate governance in relation to salaries, payoffs and those sorts of things has been called into question, why the body that's responsible for the scrutiny of public finances in the UK, why there is a demand for it. I suspect that what will happen is that there will be sensible decisions about where the limits to that are, but with greater access to the data in order that the NAO can do its job. And I think that given the corporate governance problems, it's inevitable that things are going to shift more towards that. On soft power, we in the BBC World Service tend not to use the term directly. We talk about UK reputation and cultural influence. And I think when funded directly by the British public, it is appropriate for British values and British content for the national broadcaster to be responsible for disseminating that widely and for it to be popular in the world. I don't have any problem with that at all. It's when it's used as part of a political arsenal, and people talk about deploying assets as if they're military elements, and British Council here, and the World Service will advance over that plane over there. I mean, clearly that's not how we should be used. But cultural exchange and cultural projection are things which broadcasting can do very effectively. I think it's as important that we play a role in bringing international culture to the UK and also disseminating it around the world. And as part of that, we know that British culture, British pop music, British sport is very popular around the world, and we can play an appropriate role, but it shouldn't be about one-way traffic.
Okay. Any other questions there?
In the context of accountability and transparency, there was a report into Middle East reporting called the Balin Report, done, I think, before your time. Can you tell me the politics of why that report won't be released and was refused FOI, and it went to the Information Commissioner and went to court, and they still refused to release it? What are the politics around the non-release of that report?
Well, I haven't been closely involved in that, Paul, but my understanding of it, it's not a political issue, but the explanation for it is that was a report about the BBC's own editorial content and editorial processes, and that in order for senior BBC editors to be able to look at their output and to subject to the right kind of searching questions, that if every one of those reports was published, then it would be harder for those things to be analysed and to be written down, and for the BBC to go through an appropriate process of self-improvement. So when a report about the BBC's editorial coverage has been commissioned by the BBC Trust, and there was one into the BBC's Middle East reporting, as there's been on Europe and various other subjects, of course those are published, but an exercise that's for the BBC to make sure that its journalism is as strong as possible, that may include observations on particular individual reporters, that's not been written as part of an accountability process, but is part of the BBC's effective editorial management, that wasn't appropriate for publication. That's the reason.
Okay. As a matter of interest, did not you personally, but the BBC, take any pleasure out of the Levinson inquiry and all of these newspaper journalism standards being completely exposed? Did you have a sort of a sense of, well, you know what, they've been sticking it to us for years, have a look at that?
Well, it was good copy, wasn't it? I mean, there was good stuff that came out of it. No, but
Was there a lot of water cooler conversation around it? No.
But when I travel further away than Dublin, the damage to the reputation for British journalism is significant, and the BBC isn't immune from that. I mean, obviously we've had our own problems, which I've been talking about. So no, I don't take any pleasure in that at all. I think the UK and a number of Anglo-Saxon countries take pride in high standards of conduct in public life, rules-based, effective legal systems. These models, democratic media, have been exported to the world, and journalists that I speak to in Africa look to Britain, they look to the United States as examples, and when that's undermined by conduct in whichever part of the media sector it is, that's damaging for everyone. So joking aside, in terms of the story,
you felt their pain.
Yeah, it was really uncomfortable. You know, I've sat on media panels like this in Moscow, and had the Iranians or the Chinese sort of saying, well, we can't take you seriously because of what the BBC did, or what's happened at Heathrow Airport, or what may have happened with hacking. These things at a kind of international level get kind of lumped together. So we're all in it.
Okay. Any other questions out there? No more? We can have a think about it. Just another one that strikes me is, we talked about impartiality and all of that. What do you think of the phenomenon of the journalist personality? Because it's something that I've watched evolve in the BBC as well, where individual correspondents who used to be kind of semi-anonymous, very efficient in their delivery, kind of suddenly get very expressive with their hands, and they become a little bit more soundbitey. And I sometimes feel that maybe you're trying to out-Sky to a certain extent. Is there any truth in that?
I think they have been given a bit more room for expression. I don't think you could look at the views, the judgments that they come to, and say X is consistently from this perspective, or Y is consistently from that. But that's what I was talking about, living the story, making sure that the content is engaging as well as being trusted. The trust has to come first. So if any of those, and these are largely the BBC's editors, they're not the generality of correspondents, but a particular small number of the most senior BBC journalists, being able to use proper professional judgment and then communicating it in vivid language definitely helps the audience to understand things. And as long as that is done impartially, it can be tested through the public accountability processes that the BBC has got, and heaven knows they get challenged a lot. So some of the editors and correspondents you might be alluding to have had their journalism scrutinised in exhaustive detail by the BBC Trust as our regulator, but
they might equally be encouraged a little bit to let yourself go a little bit.
Well, it's not letting. It's telling the story in a vibrant way, so it communicates effectively to audiences, and that may be partly to do with what we've been talking about, which is that there is more news with stronger flavours. There is more news with views, and if the BBC's impartial, trustworthy journalism was so worthy and so dull that no one listened to it or read it or watched it, that might be a success of esteem, but it wouldn't be doing the public job. So it's right that those journalists are given some latitude in terms of the means of expression, but not latitude in terms of personal views intruding into their BBC work.
Okay. One question here, yeah?
It seems like you're uniquely positioned to comment on this. I'm curious, with all the information and experiences passed back by foreign correspondents and their bureaus, what experiments and innovations and developments elsewhere in the world have caught your attention when you think this is something that has been done that the BBC might want to not necessarily co-opt, but obviously try on its own? Like, where have you seen really interesting experiments that I think, at least coming from the United States, we tend to focus a lot on the innovation within the US, and I'm really curious what you've seen looking outward.
Actually, I was going to give an example from the US and from an organisation I used to work at, ProPublica. I think the way in which we work with specialist communities of interest, we ought to be better at that, and that's something which we're working on at the moment. I think the way that we curate others' stories, we're probably still too focused on the BBC's own journalism rather than providing a window into other people's journalism. One of the things that I was talking about at these journalism conferences I was at in Africa recently was partnership with local journalistic organisations. So Global Voices was referred to earlier. I think the BBC needs to be more porous, more networked, open itself up to more to others' influence, while still retaining its standards, and that's where the struggle is sometimes in terms of whose content is of the right standard to be part of our content offer. But those are the areas where I would like to see us developing our journalism further.
Okay. Sarah, yeah, question.
I'm curious about balance. You know, it's a big obsession now, you know, of the media. There must be balance, and we must have both sides of the story. You referred to it in your speech. But sometimes there are stories where actually really there's only one sensible side. Evolution, or where Barack Obama was born, or perhaps not so clear-cut climate change. How far do you take the obligation to present both sides of the story? At what point do you say, actually there's only one side to this story, forget balance?
Well, we tend not to use balance. We talk about impartiality, we talk about a range of views, and balance tends to imply there's just a left-right, or two sides to the argument rather than one side. And I've used the phrase in the past, radical impartiality, in terms of a wider range of views. So actually, I think spreading things rather than narrowing things is important. There are a few areas where things have been particular factual areas where a consensus has been established, where the BBC Trust has said they're comfortable with us not having a balance of views or a sort of straightforward yes-no, and climate change is one of those, or some aspects of climate change. I mean, it's used as a very broad term, and there was a report into the science of climate change which said that where not so much in terms of mitigation and responses, but where the nature of man-made climate change was sufficiently established that was okay to report that as fact, and then to deal with the consequences of that in terms of a range of views. That's the approach we've tended to take.
Okay. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks very much for your questions. Round of applause, please.